Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about personal labels and how understanding yours can help you shift your life. I'm Emily Goldthwait. I'm an author and energy healer, and I help people have powerful self-awareness, deep self-compassion, and expanded understanding. Personal labels are what we think about ourselves, what we believe about ourselves, and how we think other people see us as well. Most of our actions, choices, perceptions, personal limitations, our relationships, and even our identity are generated from our personal labels. So where do these labels come from? Well, these labels come from meanings that we assign to experiences that we've had. They can also come from other people giving us these labels, as well as societal judgments and societal expectations can also give us personal labels. Think about what a label on a product does. A label on a product tells you what it is, what's inside, how it works, and what to expect. Likewise, our energetic labels that we give ourselves do the same thing for us. They tell us and other people who we are, what we're about, and what to expect from us, as well as how to treat us. Let's look a little bit more at how these labels are generated in the first place. So as I mentioned, one of the ways that we can generate these labels is meanings that we assign to experiences. So for example, let's say you go and you take a test and you do poorly on it. And maybe the first time you do poorly on a test, you're like, oh, well, it was just an off day, right? But maybe you consistently start doing poorly on tests, and pretty soon you give yourself this assignment of, I don't test well. I'm a bad test taker. And maybe you go deeper than that and it's a personal judgment on yourself, like maybe I'm not smart or I don't understand that subject. When there could have been a whole bunch of other factors as to why those tests didn't go well for you, what you say and assign to that experience can then become a label for you that you carry into future tests and future assignments. So let's say it's just a particular subject that maybe you missed that lesson or you didn't quite understand what the teacher was asking you. And so you're consistently getting bad on that test, but you assign the meaning that I'm a bad test taker, right? So then you go into a completely different subject matter, maybe one that you were really strong in, and you take that same test, but because you now have this label of I'm a bad test taker, you go to take that test and it goes poorly as well because that's what you expect of yourself. The next one on the list was labels we get from other people. Now this can be something that was directly said to you, like a name you were called or a title you were given in the family, like the problem child or the good child, or any one of those kinds of things. But it can also be things that we assigned, a meaning we assigned to something someone said to us. And one of the trickier ones to spot, because there is a ton of them, but one of the trickier ones I wanted to cover today was that sometimes a positive reinforcement given to us can actually cause a dysfunctional label for us. And the way that works is that so often we are seeking approval and acceptance and love. It's kind of just built into our psyche that we are always seeking these things. So growing up and even into adulthood, we're seeking social approval, parental approval, mentor approval, like we're seeking approval and acceptance. So sometimes when we get a positive feedback like, oh, good job, you did this so good, you are good at this thing, we can go, oh, that thing I just did gets me approval, it gets me love, it gets me acceptance. I'm going to keep doing that thing. And that thing can become something that can be a very big, strong suit and talent for us because we consistently do it, but we're doing it from a place of wounding, of seeking acceptance because we don't feel like we get it anywhere else. So sometimes you'll have like a very strong, dominant quality that maybe does great things in your life, but what's behind it is actually a source of wounding where that was the only way you could feel approved of and accepted. And so it became something that you put all of your energy and attention in because that's how you felt love, acceptance, and approval. Another way we get labels is from societal judgments and expectations. So every society and culture has expectations and then usually some pretty specific judgments placed upon people who do not meet those expectations. And there are many different levels of society to consider here as well. You have big picture society, and then you have microcultures within that, whether it's race or religion or your community or your specific city that you live in. each area and each people's has their own expectations and judgments on those expectations. And so when we do or do not meet up those expectations, we receive a label, whether it's like, oh, you are accepted because you have met our expectations, or you're kind of weird, you're an outlier because you don't meet those expectations. And most people within a society are pretty aware of what those expectations are and the societal judgment on those expectations. So when we do or do not meet up to those, we adopt those labels ourselves. Even if no one ever says it to us, we presume everybody is thinking that about us because that's what we are taught are the guidelines for the society that we live in. So you have things like age of marriage, or marriage or not marriage, or kids or not kids, or how many kids, or in the HOA neighborhoods, like how do you keep your house and your yard, and are you following those guidelines? One of my relatives, they had a very strong family heritage of keeping a really nice lawn. And if they weren't keeping up with that, they felt like this immense amount of shame that they were doing their family a dishonor by not keeping up with this family tradition of having a good lawn. And so that was a label that they were taking onto themselves, like, I'm not doing a good job. I'm not keeping up with my family's time-honored traditions here. And so you can create social and societal labels about pretty much everything. And when we take on those labels, it creates an immense amount of pressure and can often lead to shame and pain and feeling like an outcast or an outlier or unacceptable because maybe we don't fall within those norms. Now, I have done a lot of personal work to try and clear off my labels and find where they are and be like, I don't need that label. And it seems like every new stage and phase of my life, I discover more labels that I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize I was carrying these labels until now I see and feel like they apply to me. So I need to deal with that and like release my judgments and release my labels that I have. But a funny one that cropped up the other day that kind of caught me by surprise because it was so old and so ingrained that I never questioned it. I never had even seen it to be like, is that even my label? So my mom growing up, she had a self-proclaimed brown thumb. She couldn't get plants to live for the life of her. She, poor thing, tried everything. She planted trees, they all died. She had little potted plants, they all died. And I mean, we live in a desert, so it's very hard to keep anything that's not desert green and growing. So, but she had this perpetual brown thumb, and it was this source of sorrow for her that she couldn't get green to grow in her desert. And I grew up watching this, and without realizing it, unknowingly, I adopted that label that she gave herself. I just kind of assumed that that was my story too, that that was my label. And so I never really questioned that. I just always told everyone I have a brown thumb. Yeah, I totally have a brown thumb. I can't get anything to live. And I never bothered trying to grow anything because I just knew it was gonna die because I had a brown thumb. Well, about a year ago, I had taken some plants that were transplanted down here to the valley. They weren't from here. They were from a much wetter climate and colder climate and higher elevation. So they really shouldn't have been growing here. But this friend of mine had got them growing and it was super cool and they're medicinal. I love these plants. They were some of my favorite. And I was like, I really want these plants. And so they transplanted them into pots for me. So I've had them here in my yard for about a year and I've been trying to keep them alive. So at first I realized, oh, the sun's too strong in this spot. I need to move them to this other spot. So I've been moving them around my yard as the sun keeps changing its pattern and course throughout the year. I'm like, oh, too much sun here, gotta move it over. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, I haven't watered them in a few days, and I come out and they're like drooping and wilting, but I water them and they perk back up. And over the winter, they started to turn white. And they're in potting soil, and that's not their natural soil that they're usually in, but that was all I had. And so I had put them in potting soil, and I was like, they probably need nourishment, especially I had basil, and that was one of the plants that I had, and it wasn't a natural basil, it was like from sprouts, but I loved my basil plants. I had it for like a year in the house, and now it was outside, and I was like, poor thing, it's having like a massive shock. And so the basil was white. It was like bones of the plant just sitting there with a few scraggly leaves, and it was totally white, and I was like, clearly there's something wrong. And so I'm Googling, like, you know, what does it mean when your basil turns white? And they're like, it's dying. Like, you need to give it some vitamins. And so I was like, well, I don't really know how to do, like, will fertilizer kill my more natural plants? Like, the ones that aren't from the store? Like, how do I get these plants to, like, perk up? So I was mowing my lawn, and this seems to be a big source of learning for me, is mowing my lawn. And I was mowing the weeds that are my lawn. And the weeds are a lot more lush, and they soak up a lot more water than the grass typically does. And so when I mow it, it creates this lovely wet mush. And so I have to clean it out of my mower because it clogs up the blade. So I was cleaning out my mower, and my hands are dripping with green. And suddenly I'm looking at all this green dripping, and I'm like, if it's green, it's got a lot of vitamins in it, and plants grow green because of the vitamins that they have. So that probably means these plants have all those vitamins, and it's dripping out right now all over my hands. And I was like, I wonder if that could help without having to mulch it and turn it, back into dirt before I give it to my plants. Maybe if I just put the grass clippings, the weed clippings on my plants, maybe that'll help. I was like, if they'll help, it'll probably kill them. So I packed these around all the roots, and I come out the next day, and all of my plants have like exploded with growth. They are green, they are twice as big, and they just keep getting bigger and bigger, and like unnaturally large leaves compared to their natural habitats even. And I was like, oh my gosh. And they just had like tons more leaves. And I was so excited and so happy looking at these plants, and so excited that I'd figured out like how to take care of them, like how to nourish them. And so this has been going on for like a couple months now. And last week I was sitting there looking at my plants and just feeling this really happy feeling that they're growing, and they seem to be doing well and happy in their pots. And I sat there, and suddenly I just had this like click moment inside, and it was like, you have a green thumb. And I'm like, what? No, I have a brown thumb. And it's like, look at your plants. How long have they been living in these pots? And is this their natural, like all these listing things, is this their natural environment? And what struggles have they had? Would they have died otherwise? And then suddenly it was like, oh my gosh, like I have a green thumb. I not only took care of these plants that I really didn't know what they needed, but I figured out what they needed, and like intuitively was able to give them what they needed to bring them back from the brink of death and keep them alive, and be able to judge like what's wrong, like, oh, too much sun, let's move you over here. And that is the first time I realized that all these years, for most of my life, I have carried this label of having a brown thumb. Not even because anyone ever said it to me, but because I assumed it was my heritage from what I grew up watching. I had adopted that label for myself and said that because mom had that problem, I therefore must have that problem. And I never had even tried to challenge that label. It was just something I automatically assumed. And that's a very small thing, but for me, it felt like this immense joy, and this something was lifted off, like, oh my gosh, I don't have to carry that label anymore. That doesn't apply to me. That's not my label. And if it ever was, well, it certainly isn't now. And so now, like I said, that's a pretty lighthearted thing, but even that lighthearted thing gave me so much more openness inside, and this wonderful, happy lifting inside to realize that this negative label that I felt sad about wasn't even me. It wasn't who I am. It wasn't how I am. And that I was able to be something different. And so when you can do that with some of your more heavy labels, it creates that much more space inside of you for new possibilities and new ways of being. So as you dig in and discover and identify your labels, challenge them. Ask yourself if it's even your label to be carrying, and where it came from, and why do you have it? And if you have experiences to back up, why that label applies to you, well then right there is probably some woundings that you can heal to get that wonderful benefit of openness and possibility in your life. Being aware of your personal labels gives you the power to affect them, and to ultimately be able to release the ones that don't serve you well and are not in your best interest. That is it for today. I hope you found that helpful, and if you did, go ahead and give it a like for me and subscribe to my channel, as well as leave a comment below, because I love hearing from you guys. Every week I'm putting out more videos like this to help people like you have light, love, and joy in your journey. Take care.